As previously discussed, the Most Honorable Silis Muhammad is our expert when it comes to human rights, reparations, and obtaining identity for the Afro-descendant man and woman formerly known as African American. He has been dedicated and relentless in his pursuit thereof and has an extensive track record. So let's get into that track record as per the Lost Foundation of Islam Houston website. Silis Muhammad expands his record of achievement in the fight for Afro-descendant human rights and reparations for plantation slavery. As a dialogue with the United States President Barack Obama's administration about America's failure to honor its longtime track record in the fight for Afro-descendant human rights and reparations for slavery, Houston, Texas, April 9, 2014, Silis Muhammad, the foremost leader in Afro-descendant human rights and reparation, recently informed the black public of his letter to U.S. President Obama, Congress, the Joint Chief of Staff, and the Pope of Rome, outlining the Afro-descendant claim for reparation for slavery, which also growing his long list of achievements in the areas of human rights and reparations. While Mr. Muhammad's letter may interest the black family, it may not be known that Mr. Muhammad's work as a proven worker for Afro-descendant human rights and reparations for plantation slavery goes as far back as 1994. Rashida Tlaib Dean of the Lost Foundation of Islam said that the first time that I heard his separation, reparations, and taxation letter in Chicago, Illinois in 1990 is when I first recognized Mr. Muhammad's quest for Afro-descendant reparations. Mr. Muhammad's abbreviated list of United Nations interventions delivered in advancement of Afro-descendant human rights and reparations for plantation slavery is listed below. So here goes. 1994, petition for reparations to the UN 1503 procedure. Mr. Muhammad delivered a 1503 communication to the UN Working Group on Communications on behalf of African Americans, now called Afro-descendant. 1997, written statement to the UN. Mr. Muhammad recommended opening a forum so that African Americans, Afro-descendant, human rights grievances that form the basis of a petition submitted can be expressed systematically, as well as officially recorded, evaluated, and remedied. 1998, written and oral statements. Mr. Muhammad urged the Commission on Human Rights to assist African Americans, Afro-descendant, in their efforts to recover from the official U.S. policies of enslavement, apartheid, and forced assimilation. Mr. Muhammad prayed that the human rights of African Americans be recaptured politically and amicably, rights to self-determination rectified, and the damages sustained by awarded in great measures in order to accomplish the cathartic cleansing mentally, emotionally, and physically of 400 years of long suffering. Mr. Muhammad prayed that the U.S. government not be given the tacit approval of the UN to subvert the opening of a forum wherein African American grievances can be expressed systematically and officially recorded, evaluated, and remedied. 1999, written and oral statements. Mr. Muhammad requested recognition of the African American, Afro-descendant, choice of human rights and inalienable rights. He requested the crime of plantation slavery and its lingering effects be rectified, which was and is still a crime against African Americans, Afro-descendants, and against humanity. Mr. Muhammad asked the UN to establish a forum for the purpose of restoring African American human rights, their political being, and their status as a people. Mr. Muhammad urged recommendation that the subcommission pass a resolution recognizing slavery and the slave trade as a crime against humanity. He urged the writing of a working paper as a way to begin analyzing African American situations, Afro-descendant situations. Mr. Muhammad urged African American inclusion, Afro-descendant inclusion in the Declaration of the Rights of personal belongings to national or ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities, or a new declaration be written for African Americans, Afro descendants. Mr. Muhammad asked the International Labor Organization to look into America's privately owned prisons. Year 2000, written and oral statements. Mr. Muhammad asked that the U.S. pay reparations to the so-called African Americans, Afro-descendant, since the U.S. cannot restore the mother tongue of Afro-descendants if ever it wanted to. Mr. Muhammad recommended the U.S. to be held liable at the least for the last 51 years, plus the additional years which are needed to resolve this issue. He asked that the UN place a reparation sanction upon America if the identity and language of minorities and peoples are to be preserved. Mr. Muhammad asked that a precise dollar amount be given at a future date, if warranted, and that he stated that he would ask for the release of a number of African American human rights victims who have been unjustly incarcerated in federal and state penitentiaries. Finally, Mr. Muhammad asked that the UN to impose a sanction on the U.S. in the form of exemption from all taxation upon our people for as long as this issue is in the hands of the UN. World Conference Against Racism, written and oral statements. Mr. Muhammad recommended that the World Conference Against Racism declare a decade to consider the issue of slave descendants, including whether lost found peoples is the term that best identifies slave descendants. Regional seminars for Afro-descendants, oral statements. Mr. Muhammad put forth the name Lost Found Peoples as a name in order to gain human rights protections for slave descendants, but the name Afro-descendants was agreed upon by the unanimous consent. 2001, written and oral statements. Mr. Muhammad urged UN intervention to protect and assist African American, Afro-descendant leaders with a forum as they seek to determine the damage they have sustained and the means of reparation needed in order to bring them back to life as a people. Mr. Muhammad prayed for reparations for the damage suffered during slavery and asked the Commission on Human Rights to hear the African American demand for the right to choose to reconstitute and reconstruct lost ties, since no international instruments, arbitrations, mechanisms, or laws requiring the recognition of minorities that can restrain ethnic conflict during 2001. Attorney Harriet Abubakar, Mr. Muhammad's wife, asked the Working Group on Minorities to cause minority protection to develop in accord with the African American Afro-descendant needs for 2002, written and oral statements. On behalf of African Americans, Afro-descendant, Mr. Muhammad asked the Subcommission on the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights to acknowledge the decision that African Americans, Afro-descendants be recognized as Afro-descendant minorities. Mr. Muhammad also recommended that the Commission on Human Rights pass a resolution requesting that the Subcommission on the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights place African Americans, Afro-descendants on its agenda alongside indigenous peoples and minorities. Mr. Muhammad also put forth a prayer for official recognition of self-chosen collective identity and reparations for African Americans, now known as Afro-descendants. 2003, written and oral statements. Mr. Muhammad requested official recognition of new minorities, urged the establishment of an international year for minorities, requested support for the efforts of the Working Group on Minorities, and recommended that the Working Group on Minorities organize a second regional seminar for Afro-descendant minorities. Attorney Abubakar assisted the Working Group on Minorities to validate Afro-descendants' self-chosen identity in the documents and use any other means available to place the fact of the existence of Afro-descendants before the UN and the world. 2004, written and oral statements. Mr. Muhammad called upon the UN to grant Afro-descendants protected collective human rights. Mr. Muhammad also asked that the subcommission to make a commitment to minorities that their interventions will be heard. Mr. Muhammad requested the recognition, protection, and assistance of the Commission on Human Rights and the authorities of the UN. 2005, written and oral statements. Mr. Muhammad recommended sanctions against all governments that have deprived Afro-descendants. For every day Afro-descendants have been so denied human rights. He also requested assistance to Afro-descendants in efforts to have a self-chosen identity recognized and protected by the entire UN and by the governments under which Afro-descendants live. 2006, written and oral statements. Mr. Muhammad requested formal UN recognition of slave descendants' self-chosen name Afro-descendants and requested restoration of slave descendants to the human families of the earth. 2008, oral statement. Mr. Muhammad requested that the UN Working Group on Minorities assist Afro-descendants to establish education for Afro-descendants in their original mother tongue. 2014, open letter to U.S. President Barack Obama. Mr. Muhammad sent a letter to U.S. President Obama, Congress, General Dempsey, and the Pope of Rome requesting reparations for Afro-descendants. I know this video may be a little long and my voice may not be that exciting, but the information included here is very exciting if you understand, if you study and understand what it means for us Afro-descendants across the world and in its entirety. Do your own research and stay abreast on this very, very important and exciting information. The Most Honorable Silis Muhammad expands his record of achievement in the fight for Afro-descendant human rights and reparations for plantation slavery, 1997 through 1998. The written statement to the UN, Mr. Muhammad recommended an open forum so that African American human rights grievances that form the basis of a petition submitted can be expressed systematically as well as officially recorded, evaluated, and remedied. Mr. Muhammad urged the Commission on Human Rights of African Americans be captured politically and amicably, rights to self-determination rectified, and the damages sustained be awarded in great measure in order to accomplish the cathartic cleansing mentally, emotionally, and physically of 400 years of long suffering. Mr. Muhammad prayed that the U.S. government not be given the tacit approval of the UN to subvert the opening of a forum wherein African American grievances can be expressed systematically and officially recorded, evaluated, and remedied. Now, this is the early stages in the plight and fight for human rights within the UN. These are the early stages. This is about 97 and 98. I try not to put my own thoughts into it so you can make your own decisions and think for yourself. But think about the timing of this and at a time where reparations wasn't really openly discussed. With this segued into and the Black community and the communication and conversations that we started having with each other. And also the communication and conversations within the government, how it made segues to said apologies or attempted apologies and other reparations cases, and eventually HR 40 and them taking on or trying to take on the same approach with creating a forum. But did they really want to remedy the situation here in America, or did they have other intentions when they was doing this? But anyway, let's get back into this time period of 1997 and 1998. On July 30th, 1997, a written statement was submitted by CURE, which are the NGO CURE / AFRI, all for reparations and emancipation, and Caucasians United for reparations and emancipation, which is a NGO, and not to be sidetracked, we can talk about that another time. And the correspondence reads as such. With reference to the report of the Special Rapporteur, Mr. Maurice, on his mission to the United States of America in 1994, the Special Rapporteur accurately informed the Commission on Human Rights that the human rights of African Americans have been violated from the establishment of the United States until the present day. However, the Special Rapporteur states that racism may not now be a deliberate policy on the part of the United States government. We seek to inform the United Nations that the report did not express the bitterness of the African American people and their sincere belief that racial discrimination is a deliberate policy. Because of the exhaustion of domestic remedy, there now exists a belief that racial discrimination will never cease. This belief is confirmed by the failure of African American leaders in the United States Congress to gain permission from the Caucasian majority for a study of slavery to determine whether reparations are due. When referring to rapporteur, we're referring to a person designated by the organization to report on the proceedings of its meetings. So basically, Mr. Maurice, this special rapporteur, reported on the findings, and he did find and say that America has accurately violated the human rights of African Americans, now called Afro-descendants. However, he didn't currently believe that it was deliberate. So in writing this correspondence, they were saying that his findings didn't express the bitterness of the African American, now called Afro-descendant people, and their sincere belief that racial discrimination is a deliberate policy and has exhausted domestic remedy and currently hold a belief that racism will never cease. So based off of reading this, I'm going to give a little bit of my own opinion, and it seems like, the guy that was finding the findings was trying to let America off the hook. And this correspondence was written basically to say we ain't having that. We going head on. And they also stated that this belief was confirmed by the failure of African Americans, now called Afro-descendant leaders in the U.S. Congress, to gain permission from the Caucasian majority for a study of slavery to determine whether reparations are due. So, we being a minority, unfortunately and sadly, have to get the vote of the majority, and the majority are the Caucasians of this country. So in order to get things done, we need them to accept or give a vote to put us in favor in the majority, because without a united vote, us as a whole voting, our vote really pretty much doesn't matter against the Caucasian. Even with us being the minority, all of us voting and on something against the Caucasians still wouldn't get through because they are the majority, and whatever they unify to vote on trumps us. Continuing on. In 1993, a highly respected African American, now called Afro-descendant leader, delivered a 1503 communication to the Working Group on Communications on behalf of Afro-descendants. This communication, delivered, was by the Most Honorable Silis Muhammad, leader of the Lost Foundation of Islam, was not forwarded to the subcommission because it did not prove a consistent pattern of human rights violations. We believe the United Nations knows that a consistent pattern of human rights violations, it is already a matter of African, European, and American history brought up to the present and verified by the aforementioned Special Rapporteur. That African American, now called Afro-descendant population, is becoming aware that their 1503 communication was rejected by the Working Group and therefore ignored by the United Nations. This awareness adds to the already existing belief that racial discrimination will never cease. Making reference to the recent remarks of the United States President Bill Clinton, wherein he mentioned the possibility of an apology for slavery. We seek to inform the United Nations that the masses of African Americans, now called Afro-descendants, feel that an apology is not enough, while the masses of Caucasian Americans feel there is no reason to apologize. In monitoring the African American, now called Afro-descendant, press and internet communications, we have observed that Afro-descendants do not believe President Clinton has the interests of justice at heart. Afro-descendants have seen the United States government strike down affirmative action and special preference in universities and law schools, some of which now have 100% Caucasian enrollment. They have also seen that the United States judicial system continues to imprison African American men, now called Afro-descendants, at 10 times the rate of Caucasian men and execute the death penalty at the same rate. Now, after President Clinton's remarks, they see that the Caucasian Americans can conceive of no reason even to apologize for slavery. The prayers of African Americans for justice and reparations have been rejected by the United States government and seemingly by the United Nations because the struggle seems hopeless. That African American, now called Afro-descendant population, has reached a state of extreme anxiety. We observe that some leaders are considering changing their tactics because of the failure of peaceful and legal means of solving the problem. We believe that African Americans, now known as Afro-descendants, may decide to use extreme measures and thereby gain the attention of the world community. We fear that the United States government may respond with the imprisonment of Afro-descendant leaders. We ask the United Nations to respond to our communication by establishing a meeting wherein African American leaders, now called Afro-descendants, those who are not under the authority of the United States government, can speak to the United Nations human rights authorities candidly and privately about the desperate plight of African Americans. So even though that 1503 procedure did not go through as planned, the fight still continued, and everything within that document is pretty much self-explanatory. And about a year later, on July 10th, 1998, there was a written statement which was circulated in accordance with the Economic and Social Council Resolution 1996/31. And this written statement reads as such: making reference to Subcommission Resolution 1997/5 on racism and racial discrimination, CURE, the NGO, would like to thank the subcommission for its timely recognition of the fact that the 400-year tragedy of plantation slavery in the Americas continue to be felt, and that the African diaspora communities in the Americas continue to suffer from the legacies of the slave trade. This resolution of the subcommission gave encouragement to the so-called African Americans in the United States of America. As a consequence, our organization was able to introduce a representative of African Americans, Afro-descendants, Mr. Silis Muhammad, to the working group on minorities during their recent session in May 1998. Mr. Muhammad delivered a prayer to the working group that he had articulated some 4 years before in a communication under the 1503 procedure on behalf of African Americans, now known as Afro-descendant. His prayer was that a forum be established so that the so-called African Americans, now known as Afro-descendant, grievances could be expressed, systematically and officially recorded, evaluated, and remedied. He asked that this forum be similar to the one established for indigenous peoples in Geneva, but different in that it would be established in the United States of America, the host country of the United Nations, and the place in which 42 million descendants of enslaved Africans remain. Recognizing that the subcommission resolution refers to plantation slavery not only in the United States of America, but in the Americas, we ask that the subcommission be conscious of the fact that African Americans, now known as Afro-descendants, are in a unique position among Africans in the diaspora. African Americans, the artists formerly known as, now known as Afro-descendants, did not receive the benefits of a partial or full return to self-determination or self-government, which began to be enjoyed by Africans throughout the diaspora as a result of the movement towards decolonization in the 1960s. To the contrary, in the 1960s, assimilation was further forced upon the artists, formerly known as African Americans, through a civil rights movement which caused the demise of whatever independent economic and cultural recovery they had been able to achieve during the years of segregation. For those who would argue that the civil rights movement in the United States of America was the will of African Americans, it should be pointed out that an equally powerful movement towards human rights and self-determination took place at the same time. The late Honorable Elijah Muhammad, although not promoted in the media or sanctioned by the United States government, was able over 40 years to organize large numbers of formerly known as African Americans, now known as Afro-descendants, behind the concept of self-reliance and self-determination. Every effort was made by the United States government to destroy the independent spirit that was generated by this inspired Afro-descendant leader, then known as African American. While speaking to the Working Group on Minorities, Mr. Muhammad pointed out that the so-called African Americans had suffered utter and complete destruction of their culture, language, ethnic identity, and religion. For them, the UN protection offered to minorities is meaningless because of the particular cruelty of chattel slavery in the United States. So-called African Americans were able to retain nothing of their past and of their homelands. Hence, the truth arises that unlike some of the Africans in the diaspora who do retain remnants of their original culture and identity, African Americans possess no remnants and therefore must build their future from nothing but their own will to survive slavery. Thus, the vast majority are in the condition of a lost people whose assimilation has been so complete that they cannot identify what they suffer from. A special issue of the American magazine Newsweek reported that slavery and racism were comparable to the chicken and the egg. They concluded that the most malign legacy of slavery was racism. We agree that racism is a legacy of slavery, but we feel that along with many other legacies, it is but a symptom of the far greater problem. The right to self-determination has always been denied African Americans throughout their 443-year history in the Americas, including 222 years of being subject to the will of the United States government. We ask, if African Americans had ever been allowed, assisted, or encouraged in their efforts towards self-determination, would they now be subject to that, or subject to what is perhaps the most virulent racism in the earth? We believe that if the United Nations will establish a forum for African Americans in the United States, through that act alone, African Americans will begin to fully understand that the nations of the earth wish to help them recapture their rights as human beings. We believe that by doing this, an upcoming race war or racial violence may be averted. We join Mr. Muhammad in his prayer for a forum, and we encourage the subcommission to act upon his prayer quickly. As a recent hate crime in Texas should demonstrate, the crime wherein a black man was abducted by 3 white men and was dragged behind a pickup truck until his head was torn from his body. The potential for an eruption of racial violence in the United States is greater by the day and by the hour. We have taken notice of Resolution 1998/26 of the Commission on Human Rights regarding the upcoming World Conference Against Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance. We see that the Commission on Human Rights has invited the subcommission to carry out preparatory studies without delay and to transmit its recommendations to the Commission and to the preparatory committee. The Commission also asked for the recommendations of specialized agencies of the United Nations and the full participation of NGOs. We are responding to the call and are prepared to be involved in the preparatory process for this World Conference. As a first step, we would suggest that studies be undertaken which would serve to evaluate the damage done to the African American people. The areas that our organization has pinpointed as especially in need of study are: A, the lingering effects of plantation slavery, terrorism, and racial discrimination on the present-day physical and psychological health of the African American. We want studies specific to African Americans and related to chattel slavery. There is a great deal of information available on the subject and some enlightening research has been done, but there exists no comprehensive analysis or conclusion as to damage. The criminalization of the African American. There is broad-based agreement in the African American legal community that the United States legislature and state legislatures have passed racially discriminatory laws which target African Americans. These laws have resulted in the rapid rise in incarceration rates and rapid growth of a private prison industry. The sad fact is that young black men are now more valuable to the United States economy in prison than out. In prison, many of them are put to work manufacturing products for private corporations. The criminalization of the African Americans may soon be recognized as the resurrection of slavery in the U.S. We are confident that any studies undertaken by the subcommission or by specialized agencies of the United Nations will serve to verify the need for a forum for African Americans. We cannot express strongly enough that need for actions in response to the prayer of Mr. Silis Muhammad. We also cannot express strongly enough the need for the independence of a United Nations forum and the independence of United Nations sponsored studies. We pray that the United States government may not be given the tacit approval of the United Nations to undermine the efforts that Mr. Muhammad is making on behalf of the African Americans, now known as Afro-descendants. We continue to stress that when evaluating racism in the United States, African Americans should be studied within their own category. We assert that the racism directed against African Americans is not comparable with that directed against other people of color in the United States or ethnic or religious minorities in the United States. There is a question as to whether or not African Americans even fit within the category of minority. Therefore, we stress that the African Americans should be viewed separately from the following for the following reasons. A, because of the evidence that they do not fit the category of minority. In his closing statements to the Working Group on Minorities, the chairman, Professor E, did offer words to the effect that thought must be directed towards the problem of African Americans not fitting the category of minority and the question of where they do fit. Because of the long time period of their oppression, the brutality of their experience, the damages which have been inflicted, and the fact that they have not received any remuneration, nor have they been assisted in attaining any degree of repair, their culture, religion, language, and land, like other Africans who suffer the legacies of plantation slavery, and because of well-documented history of the United States government, subversive action taken against the grassroots movements of African Americans and manipulation of their collective will through the media. With appreciation for the efforts of the United Nations to see that justice is done in the earth, we again thank the Subcommission for the Prevention of Discrimination and Protection of Minorities for its attention directed towards the legacies of the slave trade. epic, 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 and historic. It started where they tried to corner us in, and the fight continued in an unrelentless fight at that, separating us from others, separating our struggle here in America apart from everybody else, where they could no longer consider us people of African descent. This is what led to us needing and having our own identity. This painted out the reason why we needed our own identity and the differences of us and everybody else. This paved the way and made, America start scrambling to jump ahead of the gun and get in that HR 40 and study group to study our fight and plight here in the U.S. It's paved the way for the year of Afro descent, which is still ongoing, and it also kept us in the fight where they was trying to shut us out. So this created that new door in our fight and plight in the United Nations with reparations. Salute to the most honorable Silis Muhammad. His works and continued staunch stand. And he also highlighted the importance of the most honorable Elijah Muhammad as well. Strong and big stuff here. Continue to do your own research and stay tuned for more.
5, 4, 3, 2,
Walk away from there, okay?
0.
The most honorable Silis Muhammad expands his record of achievement in the fight for Afro-descendant human rights and reparations for plantation slavery. In 1994, Mr. Silis Muhammad petitioned for reparations to the UN under the 1503 procedure. Mr. Muhammad delivered a 1503 communication to the UN Working Group on Communications on behalf of African Americans, now known as Afro-descendants. Before going into the actual document itself, let's gather some understanding of the definitions and a more general understanding of the UN itself. About the General Assembly of the United Nations. It was established in 1945 under the Charter of the UN. The General Assembly occupies a central position as the chief deliberative, policymaking, and representative organ of the UN. Comprised of all 193 members of the United Nations, it provides a unique forum for multilateral discussions of the full spectrum of international issues covered by the Charter. It also plays a significant role in the process of standard setting and codification of international law. The Assembly is empowered to make recommendations to states or international issues within its competence. It also initiated actions, political, economic, humanitarian, social, and legal, which have benefited the lives of millions of people throughout the world. UN Charter, a foundational treaty of the UN, which is an intergovernmental organization. This outlines the rights and duties of the member states and establishes the UN organs and procedures. The purpose of the UN is to maintain international peace and security, to develop friendly relations among nations based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination for peoples. Claiming human rights. The complaint procedure. The overall reference for this procedure of the Human Rights Council is the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, adopted and proclaimed by the General Assembly of the UN on the 10th of December, 1948. Implementation of the procedure. The complaint procedure, also known as Procedure 1503, is a universal mechanism bearing the number of the resolution by the former UN Commission on Human Rights which established it. The procedure is confidential and examines the human rights situation within a state. The council therefore does not decide on individual cases. The individuals or NGOs who file a complaint will not be informed about the steps taken. Generally, they receive as the only answer a letter confirming the reception of the complaint. Anonymous complaints are not accepted. That has been modified, I believe. You can research that. The complaint procedure allows an examination of such complaints which reveal the existence of a consistent pattern of gross and reliably attested violations of human rights and fundamental freedoms. Once the council received several individual cases which form a consistent pattern of gross systematic human rights violations which are reliably proved, it can decide to examine the situation of the human rights in the country concerned. As previously discussed, NGO, a voluntary group or institution with a social mission which operates independently from the government. They operate independently from the government, usually nonprofit, which shows a sign that they are not trying to do something to make money for themselves. And we will talk about the NGOs involved with this petition at another time. So this communication was received on the 18th of March, 1994. I'm fortunate enough to have a copy of this document in particular. You can get it on Amazon if there's any left. The last time I bought it, I think it was the last one. Now I've seen some more recently on Amazon. So the next page in this book is the acknowledgement. And this is how it reads. This historic petition constitutes a request for United Nations assistance in the establishment of a forum, perhaps under the auspices of the Subcommission on Human Rights, similar to the one opened for the Aboriginal peoples in Geneva, so that African American human rights grievances appertaining to reparations and self-determination can be expressed, systematically and officially recorded, evaluated, and remedied. I give special thanks to the many individuals, groups, and organizations who have labored and paved the way for this petition to be made manifest and become a reality. I shall make mention of the names of a few exceptional individuals, leaders, and groups whose efforts all culminate into the single document. W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, Malcolm X, even though he greatly deviated from his teacher, Queen Mother Moore, Congressman John Conyers, and the Congressional Black Caucus, for although they seek a domestic solution, their efforts satisfy the legal requirements of the international community by showing that the United States government has been approached and given ample opportunity to settle its own domestic affairs, but has not. A very special thanks also goes out to Dr. Y.N. Clyde, Diana Collier Clyde, Harriet Abubakar, Theodore Egan's, William Davis, Janice Miller, Robert Brock of the Self-Determination Committee, Jonita Obadil, and Kalanji Olusugan, co-chairs, and other members of NCOBRA, Minister Louis Farrakhan, and others for their exceptional efforts and dedication. And last but most certainly not the least, that divine leader and teacher to the so-called Negro, the most honorable Elijah Muhammad, the last and greatest messenger of Allah, peace be upon him. Without his presence of mind to lead us to acquire a land which we can call our own, this petition may never have been undertaken, completed, and delivered by the Nation of Islam on behalf of its members and all African American descendants of slaves. Signed, Silis Muhammad, Petitioner and Chief Executive Officer of the Lost Foundation of Islam, Atlanta, Georgia, USA, May 27th, 1994. Very professional, very gentlemanly, very unselfish, and in the spirit of unity. Now headed into the preface. We the African descendants of slaves, the so-called African American, the so-called Black American, the so-called Negro, have never tasted of the freedom that so many millions of other members of the human family enjoy, safeguard, and treasure. We are the only people on this planet that have had to endure over 400 years of the most brutal, dehumanizing slavery the world has ever known. We continue to suffer to this day from the scars of that slavery and from institutions of racism in the United States of America that deprive us of our human rights. This historic petition to the United Nations marks an end of one era and beginning of another. It marks the end of the struggle for liberty that many Black Americans have fought within the boundaries of the United States in an attempt to get our former slave masters to give us what we were born with, our human rights. We as a people have survived the post-Civil War when we were released from the physical chains and told to go with little or no assistance from the United States government. We even survived the violent and frightening reign of terror of the Ku Klux Klan and the White Citizens Councils. During the years of the Great Depression, we suffered the most. During World War II, Black soldiers were placed on the front lines to defend a nation that inflicted insults of the worst kind upon them, their families and loved ones who sought to exercise their human rights in places of public accommodations and in the workplace. We have had many great leaders during this era, leaders who begged and pleaded to the government and to the white majority Americans to do what is right and just. Among to name a few, have been Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and Booker T. Washington. The push for civil rights in the 60s brought us into a period wherein we experienced an even more cruel fate. We were led to believe that integration would be a cure-all for our woes. With this integration, we were to be able to experience life in the United States as to do the majority of white Americans. Several decades into the system of forced assimilation reveals that the glass ceiling will continue to block the vast majority of us from ever truly arriving. Our great leaders, Thurgood Marshall, Martin Luther King Jr., Ralph Abernathy, proponents of integration, did not intend to dedicate their lives' work to a system that would still manage to keep us under control. But under control, we still are. We have had several great leaders with the wisdom to see that in order to be truly free, we must be able to exercise all of the rights that citizens of our other nations exercise. We must have the right to self-determination, which includes the right to decide our own destiny, study and perpetuate our own history, culture, and languages, have real political power in determining and electing officials that will be able to protect rights and needs peculiar to African Americans, and even to return to Mother Africa with substance in order to undo the damages of slavery. Among these leaders were W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and Malcolm X. We now are at the beginning of a new era wherein we now will take our struggle for true and complete freedom to the international community via the United Nations. Our leaders in this arena is the Most Honorable Silis Muhammad, my husband, who has dedicated his life working and carrying out the mission of his leader and teacher, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. He's working day and night to enable African Americans to sit down as equals with officials of the government of the United States in a forum governed by the United Nations, so that this government will have to answer for its systematic and continuous gross violations of our human rights protected under the international law. So great is his love for his people that he has placed his life on the line in order to ensure that African Americans are afforded the right to self-determination and to receive justice in the form of reparations. I, along with countless others, pledge my love and loyalty to him in this great and historic endeavor. Those of us in this spiritual battle are warriors and are reminded of the sayings of the prophet Isaiah. For every battle of the warrior is with confused noise and garments rolled in blood. But this shall be with burning and fuel of fire. The Bible, Isaiah chapter 9, verse 5. Signed, Mashaki Muhammad, Attorney General of the Lost Foundation of Islam, Atlanta, Georgia, USA, May 27th, 1994. Very well stated there. March 18th, 1994. Petition for UN assistance under Resolution 1503. Mr. Boutros Ghali, Secretary General of the UN, United Nations, Geneva, Switzerland. Reason: the past and present gross violations of the human rights of the African American people to self-determination by means of official U.S. policies of slavery, segregation, and forced assimilation, and the refusal of the U.S. government to apologize and offer any compensation or reparations for these violations. Whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. Whereas both the fundamental rights of members of minorities to exist in equal status with the majority, as well as the historical oppression and resulting present inequality and circumstances of the African American descendants of the formerly enslaved Africans in the U.S. are well known. Keeping in mind that Articles 155 of the UN Charter specifically refer to the principle of self-determination. One of the basic purposes of the UN, according to Article 1 and 2, is to develop friendly relations among nations based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples. That Article 55 explicitly ties the principle of self-determination to respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms for all or part of its people. That the principle of self-determination is implicated in chapters 9, 12, and 13 of the Charter. That in the years since 1945, the principle has found its way into both the international covenants, the Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples, the Declaration of Principles of International Law Concerning Friendly Relations, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the decisions of the International Court of Justice in its advisory opinion in the Namibia and Western Sahara cases, just as it has been upheld by the UN General Assembly in relation to numerous recently emerging Eastern European nations, and that although long applied only in the colonial context, it has increasingly been appealed to in the post-colonial age by minorities and secessionist movements, to the extent that today legal scholars, even as before suggested, the UN itself have generally agreed that the principle of self-determination may well apply outside of the colonial context, though within strict limits. Keeping in mind that Articles 1 and 55 of the Charter commit the UN to the promotion of universal respect for human rights and basic freedoms, while Article 56 gives members nations an obligation to act jointly or separately to achieve the purpose set out in Article 55. That is, Article 56 creates a duty to act to promote respect for rights and freedoms, and that when the core human rights rooted in the principle of autonomy are grossly, systematically, and persistently violated, UN intervention to end that violation is morally and legally permissible, since the principle of autonomy implies that the government is only justifiable if the government and its policies are an expression of the self-determination of peoples. Now remember, this is the complaint procedure. This is where you lay down your case and you have to prove your case in order to be heard. This complaint procedure allows an examination of such complaints which reveal the existence of a consistent pattern of gross and reliably attested violation of human rights and fundamental freedoms. So this paves the way to the rest of the case. This is where it starts. Now, I'm not going to keep going on and read the rest of the document to you. I gave you the gist of it, and I started off in the beginning. There's a lot more left. There's a lot more to do your research on and study and, check out what was said. I have my own. I have done it, and I can do it over and over again. So check it out. The case is hammered and nailed in. I don't want to give you thoughts. I want you to think for yourself, read the document and check it out for yourself. But this document and these proceedings paved the way for a lot of other things. Just think about the date. This was in 1994. A lot of people didn't know what reparations was. We didn't talk about reparations. There wasn't all of these conversations as it is today. Now the whole conversation of reparations is everywhere. And we've even gotten some sort of reparations up to date, if you agree with that. But anyways, keep listening and stay tuned so you can hear the track record of the most honorable Silis Muhammad in human rights, and study and look at things for yourself. Don't listen to the hearsay. This is epic. In the last video, we talked about the 1503 procedure being placed and rejected. I think I said something on the lines of it, not exactly, but something on the lines of it not going according to plan. Now, that is how it looks, or how it should look. That is a perspective. There's many ways to view this. That was one way to view it. Now, let's look at a different perspective. Sometimes in life, you have to close one door to open the other, or another. This could have been the closing of one door and the opening of another. So this procedure was pretty much unorthodoxly done. It usually takes a nation or a state to do something like this. Mr. Silis Muhammad went and represented a nation of people using an NGO to get into the door and do this. So this is an unorthodox way of doing things, without already having a nation or an established nation in place. So the most honorable Silis Muhammad was brought in and introduced to UN through a traditional Caucasian American NGO, which is CURE, Caucasians United for Reparations and Emancipation. This made a statement. It made a statement in itself, and it also shows the parallel of America. Even visually, it showed it. So by using this process, the 1503 procedure in oral statements was used, and it did put on a platform. It put on a platform for the rejected pleas of our past and present civil rights leaders and their efforts. It brought them and the Muslim program to the UN. The 1503 procedure also baited in that old school narrative of the past. They used that narrative of how America has changed. That was the past. Everything's got better, blah, 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 blah. But the most honorable Silis Muhammad and the NGO used this as a way to shut that old door. that old door that America has been trying to remedy things for their racist past, etc., etc. This platform, it was the separation of the so-called African American from that whole idea. It was the basis of our separation. It separated us from those of African descent, the American Indians, or so-called. It was a separation of our total fight and plight. It was the creation of an unnamed definition that had been discussed by many of our leaders, but not given a name. It gave recognition of a nation within a nation, which were barred from freedom and self-determination. It was a segue to a platform and a form to give definition and recognition to a lost found peoples who was once lost and now on the path to being restored. Definitely a driving force in conversation reparations. Identity, revival of the fight for human rights for so-called African Americans, freedom, justice, and equality for all. This brought about the coming forums of human rights, all the pump fakes of HR 40. It was a segue to the year of African descent and the study of human rights violations. It brought about all of these holidays that we think were a gift in recognition or made in recognition, but the U.S. knew what was coming. They knew, so they tried to soften the impact with our holidays, such as Juneteenth becoming a federal holiday. We thought that was or some may have thought that was out of love. Or what is it? Columbus Day got turned into the indigenous holiday, right? So, which could be both considered sort of a slap in the face. You know, we celebrate these days, we recognize it, but, you know, slap in the face. It brought about the critical race theory and all of these other actions. It sort of seems like an indirect way of giving an apology, but it did definitely put on the map the fight and plight of our human rights leaders, all of our leaders as a whole. It put on the path the Muslim program of the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad and brought it to the UN. So that old door was closed, and this is a path to a new door. They couldn't package us up with nobody else and say they remedied us, say they helped us, say us do nothing. It started a new segue into defining ourselves and coming up with a definition of who we are. With that said, let's move in and finish up 1998 and head into 1999. In March 1998, there was a written statement which was a prayer for the protection of the human rights of the African national minority in the United States of America, the so-called African Americans at this time. Recognizing that African national minority in the United States of America has suffered destruction of its ethnic, linguistic, religious, and national identity and has been forced to assimilate into the ruling white majority culture. The so-called African Americans made up approximately 12% of the United States population. They record a 443-year history of slavery, apartheid, and racial discrimination, including 222 years under the authority of the United States government, which conferred citizenship upon them without consultation or democratic choice. The United States government officially participated in slavery and enforced cultural assimilation. United States governments officially participated in slavery, apartheid, and racial discrimination. The single attempt to repair the damage of these crimes has been an affirmative action program which gave preference not only to African Americans, but to other minorities, women, and disabled. Due to the opposition of white male Americans and the resulting action of the United States Supreme Court, affirmative action as a special measure to repair past human rights violations against African Americans has ceased after 30 years. Knowing that in 1994, a respected African American leader, the Most Honorable Silis Muhammad, delivered a communication to the United Nations on behalf of the African Americans under Communications Procedure 1503. This document offered evidence of human rights crimes with particular reference to ethnocide and forced assimilation. And it prayed for United Nations assistance and called for reparations, regretting that the Working Group on Communication determined that this document failed to show a consistent pattern of gross violations of human rights, and asserting that the enslavement and forced assimilation of African Americans is part of world history known to the United Nations. Our organization requests that the aforementioned communication, dated 18th of March 1994 and entitled Petition for UN Assistance under Resolution 1503 on behalf of African Americans in the USA, be examined by the Commission on Human Rights and its prayer taken into consideration. This communication can be consulted at the Secretariat. Understanding that the most destructive violation of human rights of African Americans remain ethnocide and forced assimilation into an alien culture, despite the attempts of American media to portray happy American blacks and wealthy black athletes. The culture of the majority of African Americans is post-slavery culture. Many African Americans have long sought to separate identity, and they have long sought to distinguish themselves from the majority population through unique musical and cultural development. Some African Americans have tried to identify with the African continent and have found that their long absence and forced removal have made them unable to reconnect. African Americans are in essence a homeless nation without identity, exploited as a servant class. Increasingly, they are being forced into criminal or suspect status. Realizing that African Americans have been represented by a government of their own design for 67 years, with citizenry submitting to their own courts of law and protected by their own military. The Honorable Silis Muhammad, the most honorable Silis Muhammad, CEO of the Lost Foundation of Islam, is moving toward independence from the United States government. The Lost Foundation of Islam seeks reparations and self-determination. The struggle of African Americans has been a long one, representing over 400 years of resistance and uprisings against repressions, torture, duplicity, lynching, and murder, political intimidation, harassment, and disruption, and forced assimilation. That this struggle is finally reaching its culminating stages is evidenced by the submission of the aforementioned petition to the United Nations under Communications Procedure 1503 and the movement of the Lost Foundation of Islam toward independence. In full consideration of the above, we believe that the African American people suffer from gross, systematic, and persistent violations of their human rights, particularly their rights to self-determination and the right to remedy for past and ongoing gross human rights violations. Our organization is concerned with the protection of the human rights of the African national minority in the United States of America. We encourage awareness of the potential for racial conflict and violent suppressions of those who are seeking independence and reparations. We urge the Commission on Human Rights to assist African Americans in their efforts to recover from official United States policies of enslavement, apartheid, and forced assimilation. Our struggle being put into words, which many do not do without leaving out parts. Very complicated and well stated. Moving on to the year 1999, the year of decision. In 1999, and it was January 1999, a written statement on behalf of African Americans was written. Silis Muhammad is the spiritual son of the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad, but for him, we so-called African Americans would not have the courage to make the following statement to the Commission on Human Rights. We thank him for the great good he did for us and perchance too for humanity. Our question is whether we, the so-called African Americans in the United States of America, are in possession of our human rights. Article 27 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which the United States of America has ratified, states in those states in which ethnic, religious, or linguistic minorities exist, persons belonging to such minorities shall not be denied the right in community with other members of their group to enjoy their own culture, to profess and practice their own religion, or to use their own language. We, the so-called African Americans, were taken away from the culture of our origin. The slave ship took us from our place of beginning. The slave master did not return us to our culture, nor did he bring our culture and teach it to us. Nor has the government of the United States of America to date sought to teach us our culture or us to it. We are absent the knowledge of our cultural beginning. The slave ship took us away from our ancestral religious belief. We were dislodged from the knowledge of our lineage to Allah, God. The slave master taught us of his religion ultimately and of his lineage to a supreme being who he refers to by the name of God. The federal or local governments of America did not teach nor make provisions for us, the so-called African American or slaves, to learn the knowledge of our transmissible religious belief. We are absent the knowledge of our ancestral tradition of our religion. Regarding our original language, there were not any provisions set in motion by the local or federal governments of America for us to cultivate and continue speaking our language. To the contrary, provisions were set in motion to prevent us from speaking our language originally. We were intentionally separated from one another with total disregard during slavery, such that we would not be able to speak our language. Ultimately, we lost the knowledge of it. Thus, to the extent that we are deprived of our culture, our religion, and our language, we are not in possession of our human rights. Moreover, to the extent that we, especially during the period of chattel slavery, were constrained by the laws, the culture, the religion, and the language of the Anglo-American, we lived, and to this day live, under a tyrannical government. By the acts of forced assimilation, the Anglo-Americans have sought also to subsume us, the African Americans, into its constitution. The desires, the perpetual existence, and the human rights of African Americans are not embodied in the majority constitution, which from its origin is absent any input from us. The laws arising from the America's majority constitution do not embody the living will of the African Americans. Thus, we feel we cannot intelligently argue the issue of violation of our human rights. While we are human, we have not been in possession of our human rights for the past 433 years. Our human rights were willfully destroyed utterly. They were destroyed by the slave masters under the auspices of the United States central and local governments during our long sojourn as slaves in America. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that the recognition of the inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. Here, at the beginning of the histories of the so-called African Americans, the enslaved Africans brought to America were defined in the same terms as the cattle belonging to the Anglo-American rulers. Thus, our rights were those of their cattle. Ours were not human rights. Yet, we were then and are still members of the human family. Our inalienable rights were distorted so completely that we are damaged goods still. We are lost from our original inherent culture, religion, and language. America cannot lawfully force us to accept the choices which it deems to be our inalienable rights, nor can it force us and our progeny to abandon the hope for the reclamation of our own. 134 years of forced assimilation have not abrogated the desire to know and to be ourselves. Today, we have no permanent national recognition as a result of slavery. We have been identified as slaves, niggas, Negroes, coloreds, Black Americans, and today we are so-called African Americans. Thus, we are this day a revolving nation, suspended within a nation, rent from our roots as a result of slavery and its lingering effects. We are detached still from our inalienable rights. To this extent, the very foundation upon which freedom, justice, and peace among nations is established is for us non-existent. Our inalienable rights are extinct, and this poses a threat to peace for the United States of America, for the Americans, and potentially for Europe. Why? It is a threat because of the despair of the many, which will endlessly be ignited to loathing and or rioting if this abnormal situation is not reversed by the few humanitarians who aim lawfully and by sanctions. So efficaciously stamp our violations of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as in the contemporary case of Iraq. The United Nations, urged by the United States, sent inspectors to Iraq so as to avert what America believes to be a threat to humanity. The United States of America for the past 50 years has violated the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. During the past 50 years, America has not seen fit to restore us to our inalienable rights, or them to us, nor has it seen fit to grant us to the choice to be, or not to be, Americans. Therefore, the statement is a request for the United Nations assistance in the establishment of a forum, perhaps under the auspices of the subcommission. The type of forum requested is similar to the one proposed for indigenous peoples. We wish the United Nations to establish a forum with the boundaries of the United States, preferably at United Nations headquarters. The government of the United States ordained slavery and forced assimilation upon captive Africans for more than 400 years. The United States government wishes to persuade the United Nations and the world today that African Americans are full and equal members of American society enjoying inalienable rights. Its propaganda is so persuasive and effective that even some of us believe that the self-determination of Anglo-American is our very own. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights states, disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind. America's disregard and contempt for human rights ought to be recognized by the United Nations, as America has dispossessed us of our culture, religion, and language, and has forced assimilation upon us. Indeed, it is barbarous, and it denies us the full enjoyment of freedom, justice, and equality. Whereas according to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it is essential, if man is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law. We therefore appeal to the persuasive powers as well as the rule of law of the United Nations and its members states to come to our aid. African Americans have looked toward and exhausted all remedies made available by the majority government, although it is viewed as the oppressor in light of the aforementioned. Cannot the United Nations open a forum for African Americans in its host country? We wish to address the question of whether we choose to reclaim or capture our original culture, language, religion, and identity, or whether we choose to assimilate into the majority culture of America. Upon this matter, we have never enjoyed the freedom of choice. We petition the Commission on the Human Rights for the rights to make our choice within the protection of the United Nations Forum. We want recognition of our choice of human rights. We want recognition of our choice of inalienable rights. We want the crime of plantation slavery and its lingering effects, which was and is still a crime against us and against humanity, to be rectified. We believe that through a forum, we can assist the United Nations in fulfilling its most noble covenant, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which envisages human rights for everyone, everywhere. At present, we are left out. So it's laid out there. Very long, complicated, and so is our plight and flight. Fight, not flight, but fight. And it's to be put out in such a way, it hasn't been done, but it's being stated. It's being recorded. It's being recognized. But let's keep it moving as we go into June of 1999. June of 1999, legacy of the African slave trade. Statements by Silis Muhammad on behalf of African Americans. The lingering effects of the plantation slavery have left me and my people in a state of genocide. Genocide is to a group as homicide is to an individual. Rent from our land, our roots, sold, and forced into slavery, we have been recognized as slaves, niggas, Negroes, coloreds, Black Americans, and today we are the so-called African Americans. We are more than 40 million, and yet we are a dead people, a people dead. We have been dead as slaves for 400 years. It is not our struggle for human dignity equally as important as that of groups at war for their human life. Ours is a war of the mind. The United Nations will send troops to protect physical life. Is not our war as great? Is not the mind as precious as the body? To be alive with the knowledge that I am, as a man, dead is worse than physical death. Death of the physical body sets you free. Death of the human spirit is a living hell. Beginning with slavery and to this date, we are a revolving nation within the nation of America. We are absent our foundation, our human rights, culture, religion, and mother's tongue. We have lost our original identity. While we are a people and not a minority, we are treated as a minority by the United States government. Therefore, we bring our case to the Subcommission on Prevention of Discrimination and the Protection of Minorities. The Declaration on the Human Rights of Persons Belonging to National or Ethnic, Religious, and Linguistic Minorities, which flows from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, addresses the questions of identity. Concomitantly, the Universal Declaration envisages, to quote Professor Eade, the establishment of a common framework of protected human rights for everyone, everywhere. The United States knew upon the adoption of the Universal Declaration on the 10th of December 1948 that African Americans did not have their original mother's tongue, their inherent religion, or their ancestral culture, their human identity. America did not have us in mind at the time of signing that document, or it had the intention to persuade the United Nations that it did. To the extent that the United Nations left us out of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the government of the United States has designed a falsehood which has hampered the United Nations and its member states. We have been left out of the Declaration on the Rights of Minorities also because of this falsehood. To be left out of both the Declaration on the Rights of Minorities and the Universal Declaration is to not have recognition of our human life politically. We have no identity because we were intentionally deprived of education in our mother's tongue. Thus, we do not have our own culture. Absent our culture, we exist in a state of civil death. We are concerned about our right to education in our mother's tongue, as we know that it would guarantee us an identity. We appreciate the Declaration on the Human Rights of Minorities and its focus on education, but we conclude that even if the United States wanted to, it cannot restore us to our family roots in our mother's tongue. It cannot trace our lineage except to the continent of Africa, where there exists over 1,200 families of languages. Therefore, we must be allowed to choose the mother's tongue or tongues that we as a people wish to speak. We feel we must have the protection of a United Nations form as we engage in this stage of the mental war for our identity, lest we be targeted and considered subversive by the United States government. Our identity as a people in possession of our human rights can never be achieved if left entirely to the will of the United States. Why? America's refusal to ratify the Convention on the Non-Applicability of Statutory Limitations to War Crimes and Crimes Against Humanity in 1968. Some 20 years after the adoption of the Universal Declaration, makes it blatantly clear again that it did not have in mind human rights for everyone, everywhere. The failure of the United States to ratify that particular convention reveals the intent of the United States government at the moment and time of its act. Its thinking, it's consistent with its thinking in 1948. Either it did not have us in mind, or it seeks specifically to block the pathway to our human rights, our identity. while holding us in this ever-revolving state. The United States holds itself as being in full compliance with spirit of United Nations, protected human rights for everyone, everywhere, and causes us to remain trapped within the Anglo-American culture, regenerating her religion and tongue, in reality, her identity. Thus, the United States has committed fraud against the United Nations, genocide against us, and we linger in a state of civil death. As our identity has not been preserved, we conclude that since its inception, a consistent violation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has been perpetrated by the United States. We recommend the establishment of a United Nations forum with expert guidance for African Americans in the United States at United Nations headquarters. We believe that the United Nations has a moral obligation to persuade the United States to financially provide for the forum, inasmuch as the fraudulent acts of the United States government have hampered the United Nations in fulfilling its obligation to protect human rights for everyone, everywhere. Surely there ought to be grave concerns that more than 40 million people have been left out and do not have their protected human rights. If the United States government refuses to financially support a forum, we would gratefully accept the sponsorship of the United Nations or any sympathetic government. We want a forum for the purposes of restoring our human rights, which only we can reclaim or choose, our legal, political being, and status as a people. Within a forum, we will promote respect for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights amongst ourselves, which will ultimately include the diaspora, rebuilding a kind of council or governing body amongst ourselves, absent the social engineering of the United States government. Openly discuss within this council the devolution of pertinent parts of the Constitution of the United States, which defines us as 3/5 of a human being. Make choices on mother's tongues or tongues that we as a people wish to speak, and discuss reclamation, restoration, repatriation, reparations, and migration of some of us to a friendly nation. This package will be presented to the United States. The venture commence intelligence can be gained for the subcommission that might usefully address the continuing legal, political, and economic legacies of the slave trade as experienced by the victims. We want these discussions to benefit race relations in the society of the United States. The establishment of a forum for the reasons stated would also eliminate the burden of slavery for America's future generations. There it is, laid out. This is the conclusion to this video. Well stated, heavy weighted. And just for disclaimer purposes, this is me sharing relevant information that excites me, that I believe everybody needs to know or should know. I do give my own opinions. My opinion is just that. It's my opinion, and I'm entitled to having an opinion. But other than that, this is information that I deem necessary to be shared. It excites me, and I'm sharing.
We, the lost found nation of Islam, have spent close to 17 years at the United Nations. During these years, our fight has been to establish an identity. The identity we have chosen for ourselves is not just for us, here in America, but also for blacks from many nations, following the prophecies of the Holy Quran and Bible. God said He would gather His people out of every nation where they are scattered. We, the lost found nation of Islam, were instrumental in accomplishing that. We have gathered together the scattered children of former slaves in the entire slavery diaspora, North America, Central America, South America, and the islands. We had progressed to the point that we had the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights supporting us for an entire week in Chincha, Peru, during a November 2005 UN regional seminar. All you could hear from every UN official speaking, and every nation was the term Afro-descendants. That was just one seminar. The culmination, or some say the birth, of Afro-descendants. There were several seminars, and each time we had a seminar there were some countries that did not show up. But we, the lost found nation of Islam, have always been there at every seminar. We saw all of those who came and went. We made a substantial donation towards the expenses of the seminar in Chincha, Peru, and we were sponsors for smaller countries who attended that seminar. All for the purpose of establishing a global identity, not reparations, but an identity. While reparation has won our plights, we were not in Peru to gain reparations. We were in Peru to gain an identity. What identity? Afro-descendants. The UN has the name, Afro-descendants, on their records. Chief Osiris Akabala, in his intervention at the United Nations, said we want reparations. We demand reparations. We demand that you pay us reparations. After he spoke, we waited for a little while and said we understand that you, the UN, cannot pay reparations. Our point to the officers of the UN and to Chief Osiris was that the UN does not pay reparations. People do not come to the UN to get reparations. The UN does not pay reparations. We went to the UN to be reinstated into the human families of the earth because the UN, prior to then, did not recognize us. We did not have human rights. The UN had grouped us with the English, Spanish and Portuguese-speaking Caucasians in the countries in which we live. We were subsumed in the Americas. And we sought to bring a wedge between us and Caucasians. To let the world know we are not Caucasian and that we have a different identity from them. But, what is that identity? We are no longer Africans only. Because of the Mediterranean and transatlantic slave trades, we are, today, scattered into many lands and cultures. Our ancestors, stolen from their homeland, Africa, were forcibly bred, and raped, and severed from original identity. Until we, the descendants, no longer viewed ourselves as Africans only. Neither are we viewed as Africans by continental Africans, who themselves suffered colonization. So, we were a lost people. A question mark, until we self-identified as Afro-descendants. We did that. The lost found nation of Islam. Haiti, Cuba, Costa Rica, Panama, Nicaragua, Jamaica, Uruguay, Brazil, Colombia, Peru, Mexico, Canada, and all nations. Where we have been scattered should have been there, they were welcomed there. The major nations in which we were scattered were present. We verbally gave name to ourselves under the umbrella and protection of the United Nations, which is what we first went to the UN to do. We asked for a forum. In the first oral statement to the UN, in 1998, we asked the UN to do that. To recognize us as a people, separate from the countries in which we live, and the UN has done this. From 2001 to 2006, the UN allowed and helped us to self-identify and then began calling us by our new, self-chosen name. There were seminars in Honduras, Canada, Switzerland, South Africa, Peru, and Chile, while we were in Durban, South Africa, to take part in the World Conference Against Racism WCAR, and we did take part in the WCAR. We had a separate seminar with Professors Jose Bengoa and Esbjorn Ida. It was in Santiago, Chile, where the term, Afro-descendants, was first heard, and Ajani Mukarram, president of the Lost Found Nation of Islam, was present before 2001 and before Durban. With that said, we offered to the various groups, or organizations, among us the following. For accounting and global census purposes, will you, Brethren, Pan-Africanists, nationalists, biracials, blacks, Americans, Africans, African Americans, billions, new Africans, and other self-declared nations among our people, step forward to the global identity, Afro-descendants. as did the lost found nation of Islam and our brothers and sisters in Brazil. Most Latin American countries had already accepted the global identity, Afro-descendants, when the lost found nation of Islam was objecting to it. During the UN-sponsored regional seminar in La Ceiba, Honduras, the lost found nation of Islam, for a second time, objected to this new global identity, Afro-descendants. During the seminar, a representative from Brazil, who has the largest Afro-descendant population in the slavery diaspora, stated that they, too, did not agree with the name Afro-descendants. That was already in use by Latin Americans but acquiesced to establish unity with the many blacks already using the term. We were proposing lost found people. Professor Jose Bengoa arranged for a special meeting between Cuba and the lost found nation of Islam. After hearing the Brazilian delegates' comments, and being asked to meet with Cuba, we began to think about the term Afro-descendants. The feel and weight of the term Afro-descendants in the atmosphere among the Latin delegates was so great, that we, the lost found nation of Islam, decided to concur and use the term like the Brazilians had done. We quickly sketched out a rough definitions of Afro-descendants. Within the 15-minute time frame we had before the meeting with Cuba was to get started. A representative from the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights translated the meeting between us. The representative of Cuba asked us, in Spanish, if we had anything to say to her. After her statement was translated, we replied with a definition for Afro-descendants, showing our agreement, to which the representative showed surprise, or so it seemed from her countenance. So, we offer to you, African Americans, a just people, the global identity, Afro-descendant. The term, African American, is not favored by Latin countries. The measurements of us all is some 250 million Afro-descendants in the slavery diaspora. In no way does your national identity change, unless you change it. We are speaking of global identity. In Durban, South Africa in 2001, we were still working on our identity, we were not working to define it yet. We did not have a clear-cut identity although the term, Afro-descendants, was in the air. We had not decided, collectively, on an identity. In Durban, the December 12th movement, headed by Roger Wareham, was attending meetings in one room while we, the lost found nation of Islam, were in another room. The December 12th movement, Harry Belafonte, Danny Glover, and many others were campaigning for reparations. It is reported that some 400 black attendees were present along with the December 12th movement, including Jesse Jackson. The transatlantic slave trade and reparations was the language spoken in that room in Durban at WCAR. Which to believe? The U.S. government to boycott this conference. The World Conference Against Racism was about racism. I cannot knock what Roger Wareham is doing, because the lost found nation of Islam will benefit from the results of the reparations advocates' language, too. And, while they were in that room and we were in another room, we did come contact with one another. But, we all know that the UN cannot pay us reparations. We well know that we were not recognized in 2001 by the UN as a people, we were just hollering, making noise. The UN did not recognize us. We had no voice. No human rights. Our fight in the UN has been to re-established, reconnected, to the human families of the earth and be recognized by the UN. Once the UN recognizes us, then we can call upon the UN for assistance, as like any other nation can call upon the UN for assistance. As like any other nation can call upon the UN when human rights of their citizens are trespassed upon. But, first, we needed recognition. In order to gain recognition, we needed an identity. In order to gain an identity, we gathered the scattered children from every nation and self-identified ourselves. We asked for recognition of our human rights, which is our own culture, language, religion, and so on. While we asked for that, simultaneously, members of the lost found nation of Islam were functioning as a just government, in its early stages. For black people, a government that we invite and encourage all Afro-descendants to become part of or an ally with. Governments of nations that are members of the UN have to sign on to and ratify the covenant or law for which they wish to be held liable. If they do not wish to be liable for it, they do not sign it and they do not ratify it. Thus, if a violation comes up, they are not held responsible. In Durban, at the WCAR, the committee that made up the final draft of the Declaration and Program of Action of the 2001 DARE did say that the transatlantic slave trade should be considered a crime against humanity. There is a law in the UN about crimes against humanity. It is referred to as the Convention on the Non-Applicability of Statutory Limitations to War Crimes and Crimes Against Humanity. That is already a law in the UN. But the US has refused to sign and ratify it. So, even if this committee that wrote the final document said transatlantic slave trade was a crime against humanity and should have been so, it is just language in the conference documents. It is not law, it is not mandated by any official body of the UN. It has not been haggled over for 12 months, or 4 years, or 10 years. In 1 week, they make a decision that the transatlantic slave trade, was a crime against humanity, in their hearts, but the UN law on the non-applicability of statutory limitations to crimes against humanity is not binding on the US because the US did not sign and ratify it. Thus, they cannot be held liable for it. We understand and know that the UN does not pay reparations out of its treasury. But we also know that the UN, in all of its glory, can be asked to be an adjudicator. The only way to bring the US to justice is to turn the world pressure against it. Going to an impartial adjudicator, the UN, for justice, to be awarded compensation, instead of going to the one who injured us, is accomplishing that. This is the reason why we went to the UN. However, we found that we did not exist as a people in the UN. And an identity had to be established before we could ask for justice. My point is that our fight is for reparations. But part of this fight is our fight for an identity, to be recognized by the UN as belonging to the human families of the earth again, ethnogenesis. We did speak on identity in Durban at the WCAR before the plenary, which was the entire body of government, representatives. Our message was about identity. Reparation is on the back of our minds, but we know, because we have a legal background, too, that the US did not sign that document and cannot be held liable for that document. UN officials were under the illusion, when they hear Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. saying that white children, and black children, will walk hand in hand. That we were, all the same, they apparently concluded, that we were happy with our plight, and satisfied, that we were being identified as Caucasian, since no black persons had penetrated the wall put up by the US in the UN, until the lost nation of Islam came and told the UN otherwise. Other blacks had gone to the UN, but none had penetrated this veneer. They thought we were happy and satisfied here in America, based upon Martin Luther King's dream. The Afro-descendants government should approach the UN on reparations. For when a government speaks, it has more power. It would have more weight than an individual speaking. It could galvanize world pressure. The government of Afro-descendants could declare a national emergency. The efforts of an individual are just futile. The UN hears you. But they cannot do anything about it because you are not a government entity. About 11 years ago, we established a government. So, we would say that when our government stops dragging its feet and takes care of the people's needs and business, then it would be heard.
In April of 2000, there was a written statement to the Commission on Human Rights. Written statement to the 56th session of the Commission on Human Rights, Provisional Agenda Item 14, Specific Groups and Individuals, Minorities. Silis Muhammad is the spiritual son of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. He sojourns amid 40 million black men and women in the United States of America whose foreparents were brought to the United States aboard slave ships. They were brought to America over 400 years ago. during the period of plantation slavery were forcibly denied the rights of speaking their mother tongue. Today, the lingering effects of plantation slavery deny us, the so-called African Americans, the enjoyment of speaking our mother tongue in community with other members of our group. This inherent human right is set forth in Article 27 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. We, the so-called African Americans, are charging the United States of America with the denial of the use of our mother tongue. Article 27 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights states, in those states in which ethnic, religious, or linguistic minorities exist, persons belonging to such minorities shall not be denied the right, in community with other members of their group, to enjoy their own culture, to profess and practice their own religion, or to use their own language. We are human beings, but to this date in time, we are denied the human rights of speaking our own mother tongue. It was taken during slavery. The United States grants the right today for us to speak it. Then speak it, one might say. How can we speak what the U.S. has denied us the use of? If our mother tongue is taken away, aren't we denied the use of it? No. One may say you are deprived the use of it. There is a difference. It's not to be deprived of the use of our mother tongue the same as being denied the use of it. No, says the state. To be denied the use of it presupposes it is in your possession, while being deprived of it, its use presupposes it has been taken away. Well, since it has been taken away, we are both deprived and denied the use of it. The very act of taking our mother tongue away was for the express purposes of denying us the use of it. In fact, the act is tantamount to a gross and excessive permanent denial. The United States craved for the denial of our use of it so strongly that it deprived us of the very instrument. Thus, this will be viewed as a gross and excessive act of denial of the United States to permit the so-called African Americans to speak their mother tongue in community with other members of their group. While the act of the United States may be viewed as an act against humanity, equally so has the United States made itself responsible for the rights of minorities within its jurisdiction, it not be denied the use of their own language in community with other members of their group. We, the so-called African American, cannot speak ours. The United States grossly denies us the right, having deprived us continually of the very instrument, and in its place, the United States continually has forced its Anglo-Saxon mother tongue upon us for the past 400 years. Absent our mother tongue, we are non-people, living in a state of civil death. In addition, we are denied a permanent identity. Rent from our land in Africa, our roots, sold, and forced into slavery. We have been recognized as slaves, niggers, Negroes, coloreds, Black Americans, and today we are the so-called African Americans. While holding us in the ever-revolving state, the United States holds itself out as being in full compliance with Article 27 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Yet the United States causes us to remain trapped within the Anglo-American culture, regenerating its mother tongue, in reality, its identity. One's mother tongue is the essential route to one's identity. It is the manner in which one's identity is passed from generation to generation and through which one's culture and religion flow. Professor Gulalame's working paper on education, rights of minorities, Hague Recommendations states that language, but not just any language, one's mother tongue is intimately bound with identity. Absent exposure to our original tongue at the earliest possible stages in life and in primary and secondary levels of schooling, how could and can we speak it with other members of our community and preserve our individual identity? By forcibly stripping us of the use of our language and of the right to be educated in the same, the government of the United States deracinated our collective identity, making our condition irreversible. We need special assistance. While we are a people and not a minority in the United States, we are placed within a minority status. Hence, we call upon the United Nations to come to our succor under Article 27 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, as the lingering annihilation of our mother tongue and the continual force by the United States imposed upon us to speak its Anglo-Saxon mother tongue at the earliest possible stages in our lives is the continual extermination of both our individual and collective identity. Absent identity, we do not have our own culture. Absent culture, we live today in a state of ongoing civil death, genocide. We are a people who are buried politically. The United States has killed our human rights and has covered us over with its own fraudulently by trick and by duress. We were buried and hidden. So very much so, the United Nations, in making its laws, has left us out, it seems. It is not known immediately where we fit in the United States. We, the so-called African Americans, mimic the human rights of the majority, but in reality, we are in the position of a minority, as every scholar knows. In conclusion, we pray for compensation in the form of reparations. We ask that the United States pay reparations to the so-called African Americans, since the United States cannot restore our mother tongue if ever it wanted to. Nor can the United States continue illegally to choose and force upon us, which it has done for the last 400 years. The United States should be held liable at least for the last 51 years, plus the additional years which are needed to resolve this issue. We ask that the United Nations place this reparation sanction upon America if the identity and language of minorities and peoples are to be preserved. The precise dollar amount will not herein be stated, but will be presented when we are satisfied that the gravity of our argument in the eyes of the United Nations warrants it. Along with the dollar amount, we will ask for the release of a number of African American human rights victims who have been unjustly incarcerated in federal and state penitentiaries. Finally, we ask that the United Nations impose a sanction on the United States in the form of exemption of all taxation upon our people for as long as this issue is in the hands of the United Nations. April 2000, oral statement to the Commission on Human Rights, item 14B, specific groups and individuals, minorities. The lingering effects of plantation slavery leave my people and me in a deprived state. We are deprived of our mother tongue. Today, the United States of America grants minorities the use of their own language, but mine was forcibly taken away. I am denied and deprived of its use. Article 27 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which the United States has ratified, declares, in those states in which ethnic, religious, or linguistic minorities exist, persons belonging to such minorities shall not be denied the right, in community with other members of their group, to enjoy their own culture, to profess and practice their own religion, or to use their own language. We, the so-called African Americans in the aftermath of plantation slavery, cannot speak our own language in community with other members of our group. The U.S. government took it away. African Americans originate from many parts of Africa, encompassing hundreds of languages. Therefore, it would be impossible to implement the prayer of African Americans regarding the loss of their mother tongue. The inability to implement a remedy makes it impossible to enforce any law. Our prayer, however, is for reparations. In this way, America can address this legal and moral wrong. We will choose a language pleasing to us. This argument is being made by a group that represents only 1/10 of 1% of African Americans in the United States. Nonetheless, the argument is made. In conclusion, we ask that the United States pay reparations to the so-called African Americans, as the United States cannot restore our mother tongue, if ever it wanted to. Nor should the United States continue illegally to choose and force one upon us, which it has done for the last 400 years. We ask that the Commission on Human Rights recommend a reparation sanction against the United States to ECOSOC and the General Assembly. Oral statements to the 6th session of the Working Group on Minorities, May 2000. Agenda Item 3B, to examine possible solutions to problems involving minorities. Greetings, Mr. Chairman, members of the Working Group on Minorities. The lingering effects of plantation slavery leave my people and me in a deprived state. We are deprived of our mother tongue. To date, we are denied and deprived of its use. Article 2.1 of the Declaration on the Rights of Persons Belonging to Minority States. Persons belonging to national or ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities have the right to enjoy their own culture, to profess and practice their own religion, and to use their own language in private and in public, freely and without interference or any form of discrimination. Today, the United States of America grants minorities the use of their own language. It has ratified Article 27 of the ICCPR, which declares in those states in which ethnic, religious, or linguistic minorities exist, persons belonging to such minorities shall not be denied the right in community with other members of their group to enjoy their own culture, to profess and practice their own religion, or to use their own language. But we, the so-called African Americans, in the aftermath of plantation slavery, cannot speak our own language. The U.S. government took it away. It was forcibly taken away. African Americans originate from many parts of America, encompassing hundreds of languages. Therefore, it would be impossible to implement the prayer of African Americans regarding the loss of their mother tongue. That an inability to implement a remedy makes it impossible to enforce any law. Our prayer is, however, for reparations. In this way, America can address its legal wrong and moral obligation. We will choose a language pleasing to us. In conclusion, we ask that the Working Group on Minorities in its report to the subcommission recommend that an expert be appointed to engage in dialogue with the U.S. government. The urgent prayer of African Americans for reparations should be the subject of this dialogue. Our recommendation is made in light of the fact that 40 million people are suffering this continuing legal wrong. 6th session of the Working Group on Minorities, Agenda Item 3B, examining possible solutions to problems involving minorities. Statement by Harriet Abubakar. Greetings, Mr. Chairman and members of the Working Group on Minorities. I am grateful for the opportunity to speak a second time before the Working Group on Minorities. My name is Harriet Abubakar. I am a descendant of slaves of the United States of America. I speak as an attorney and founding member of the National Commission for Reparations. My concern is with Agenda Item 3B, examining possible solutions to problems involving minorities, and also Agenda Item 3C, further measures for the protection of persons belonging to minorities, which could act as examples or be replicated. Article 1.1 of the Declaration on the Rights of Minorities say that states shall protect the existence and the national or ethnic, cultural, religious, and linguistic identity of minorities within their respective territories and shall encourage conditions for the promotion of that identity. Professor Eady, in his commentary on the Declaration, tells us that first requirement of Article 1.1 is to protect the right to existence in its physical sense, and the fourth requirement is to protect the identity. We African Americans, from the 400-year experience of plantation slavery, know that physical existence has little value without identity. Therefore, we are grateful that the Declaration on the Rights of Minorities recognizes the importance of identity. Our experience is an example for the civilized world of a Holocaust wherein identity is exterminated. Within our experience is the example of the means that a state can use to forcibly, intentionally, and permanently sever a people from their identity. Within our experience is the example of how a people in such a deprived condition, by their very nature and against terrible opposition, will seek without rest to find their lost identity. Within our experience is the example of how a state systematically, for the benefit of the majority, can obstruct the attempts of a people to identify themselves. Within our experience is the example of what extraordinary damage can be sustained when a people's identity is lost and the identity of the majority is forced upon them. Because of our experience with plantation slavery, we know how human dignity is attached to identity. We are a people living within the United States as a minority. Without identity, we have no legal political status or recognition internationally, no respect for the majority population domestically, and no dignity among our fellow human beings. We believe we can assist the Working Group on Minorities in defining the crime of destruction of identity and understanding and its consequences upon civilization as a whole. Silis Muhammad refers to our current condition as civil death. We want to be restored from civil death so that we might live again in dignity, with respect. We believe we can help the Working Group on Minorities to develop measures that might serve as a solution for us, an example for the civilized world. African Americans have been seeking an identity as people since emancipation from slavery more than 100 years ago. Since that time, the majority population has called us niggas, Negroes, colors, Black, and African American. They have forced upon us the Christian religion, the English language, and the Anglo-American culture. Simultaneously, numbers of our people have searched far and wide, trying to find an identity that would better fit our nature. Among the more prominent identities that we have claimed are Nubian, Islamic, Hebrews, Kemetic people, Hebrew Israelites, Moors, Israelite law keepers, Cushites, and Asiatic black men and women. Politically, our leaders have given us the United Negro Improvement Association, Symbionese Liberation Army, Pan-African Nationalists, Black United Front, African People's Socialist Party, National Association for the Advancement of Color People, Uhuru Movement, Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, Republic of New Africa, Black Radical Congress, New Black Panther Party, and so on. Our leaders have borrowed from the cultures of other identities as well as inventing the Afrocentric and Rastafarian cultures. I am among those who have chosen the family of Shabazz, the religion of Islam, and the government and culture of the Lost Foundation of Islam. As you can see, we are fractured into many pieces as a people. We have searched and cried for collective identity while the U.S. government has systematically sought to keep any of our leaders from gaining too much influence. The U.S. government has defamed the best of our leaders and placed them in jail. While defaming or destroying our leaders, the U.S. government has put forth leaders of its own choice through use of the media. The U.S. government held us captive in plantation slavery, and it captures us still through manipulation, both of our will and those who would help us around the world. Ours is a situation where conflict is certain if we are unable to bring an end to our captivity. For some time, Silis Muhammad has prayed that a forum for African Americans be established at UN headquarters. He has said that within a UN protected forum, African Americans can establish a council or governing body amongst themselves. And within this council, they can begin the process of reclaiming or choosing our legal political being and status as a people. Surely the Working Group on Minorities can now see the reason behind Mr. Muhammad's prayer. Silis Muhammad has also prayed that the UN place a reparations sanction upon the United States. The demands for reparations is becoming widespread among African Americans. UN involvement and protection is essential to us as we become ever more vulnerable to the U.S. government manipulation of our will. I am here to ask the Working Group on Minorities to recognize us as a people and a minority in need of special assistance. We have suffered from the loss of that very thing, the Declaration on the Rights of minorities seek to protect identity. If our condition is not of concern to the UN, then how can the minorities and people of the earth find their protection in law that the UN creates? I am here to join Silis Muhammad in his prayer for appointment of an expert to engage in dialogue with the United States on the subject of reparations. The National Commission for Reparations asked the Working Group on Minorities to consider his prayer and make a favorable recommendation to the subcommission on behalf of the so-called African Americans. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sixth session of the Working Group on Minorities, Agenda Item 4, the future role of the Working Group, statement by Ida Hakeem. Greetings, Mr. Chairman and members of the Working Group on Minorities. I appreciate being able to make a few comments. The sixth session of the Working Group has been greater than the past session in my view. There is serious working atmosphere and yet a relaxed atmosphere. It seems that the minorities themselves are being given more consideration, and that is much appreciated. Also, the working papers are found to be very informative and beneficial. The attendance of more state representatives is gratefully noted. In my view, the intent of the working group to promote mutual understanding between and among minorities and governments is an excellent and appropriate intent. We hope that the working group will take the intent one step further and hear the prayer of the African American representatives. Expert dialogue with the U.S. government on the subject of African American reparations would, at this time, be one of the few ways in which the working group could serve to promote mutual understanding between the minority in question and the government. There is another role that I believe the working group could expand upon, and that is in assisting the African American minority in its efforts at self-organization. African Americans have a well-documented collective experience which is of the essence to all minorities, that of the complete annihilation of identity and severing of ties to ancestry, and the consequences of this criminal act upon the collective human spirit. The working group could invite African Americans to share their accumulated wisdom with other minorities and with the experts in the form of a written document. An invitation to share experience would have a beneficial effect as follows. First, African Americans in the U.S. are to a great degree convinced that the U.S. government controls the UN. They have been very slow in believing that the United Nations will be able to do anything of substance for them, and it has been difficult for us to argue that the UN will recognize their suffering in a meaningful way. If the Working Group on Minorities were to invite African Americans to share their experience in the form of a written document, the word would spread within the African American communities that the UN is listening. Just this act of listening can serve to promote the self-organization of African Americans. Additionally, an invitation to prepare an official document of experience would facilitate the gathering together of a core group of Black leaders and intellectuals. In our view, this core group could potentially evolve into the foundation of a council or governing body. Finally, I would like to make one small comment on the commentary to the Declaration on the Rights of Minorities prepared by Professor Eid. The commentaries are very helpful and very much appreciated. As to the importance of identity in Article 1.1, would say that we view identity as equal as importance to physical life. The individual human being enjoys physical life. The collective enjoys a collective spirit, which is identity. Both the life of the body and the life of the human spirit are essential. Thank you for listening. Written statement to the 52nd session of the Subcommission on the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights, August 2000. Agenda Item 8. Prevention of discrimination against and protection of minorities. The lingering effects of plantation slavery have left my people and me in a deprived state. We are deprived of our original identity. We, the so-called African Americans, have experienced the forcible removal of culture, religion, and mother tongue. The annihilation of our mother tongue is the extermination of our identity. To the extent that we have been deprived of our culture, our religion, and our language, we do not have our human rights. We have been dispossessed of those human rights, possessed by every minority and people, and protected by the United Nations. While we are a people and not a minority in the United States, we are placed within a minority status. We mimic the human rights of the majority, but in reality, we are in the position of a minority, as every scholar knows. The United States of America has destroyed our human rights. It has covered us over with its own fraudulently by trick and by duress. We were buried and hidden, so very much so that the United Nations, in making its laws, has left us out, it seems. It is not known immediately where we fit. To be left out of both the Declaration of Rights of Minorities and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights is to not have political recognition of our human rights. Thus, we feel we cannot intelligently argue the issue of a violation of our human rights. While we are human, we have not been in possession of our human rights for the past 400 years. Our human rights were willfully destroyed utterly. They were destroyed by the slave masters under the auspices of the United States central and local governments during our long sojourn as slaves in America. We, the so-called African Americans, were taken away from the culture of our origin. The slave ship took us away from our ancestral religious belief. Regarding our original language, there were not any provisions set in motion by the local and federal governments of America for us to cultivate and continue speaking our language. To the contrary, originally, provisions were set in motion to prevent us from speaking our language. We were intentionally separated from one another with total disregard during slavery, such that we would not be able to speak our language. Ultimately, we lost the knowledge of it. By forcibly stripping us of this use of our language and of the right to be educated in the same, the government of the United States deracinated our collective identity, making our condition irreversible. Absent exposure to our original tongue at the earliest possible stages in life and in primary and secondary levels of schooling, how could and can we speak it with our other members of our community and preserve our individual identity? The United States causes us to remain trapped within the Anglo-American culture, regenerating its mother tongue, in reality, its identity. When we are able to argue about a violation of our human rights, this is our complaint. We are human beings, but to this date in time, we are denied the human rights of speaking our mother tongue in violation of Article 27 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which the United States of America has ratified. The United States grants the right today for us to speak our language. Then speak it, one might say. How can we speak what the U.S. has denied us the use of? If our mother tongue is taken away, aren't we denied the use of it? No, one might say. You are deprived of the use of it. There is a difference. It is not to be deprived of the use of our mother tongue the same as being denied the use of it. No, says the state, to be denied of the use of it presupposes it is in your possession, while being deprived of it, its use presupposes it has been taken away. Well, since it has been taken away, we are both deprived and denied the use of it. The very act of taking our mother tongue away for the express purposes of denying us the use of it, in fact, the act is tantamount to a permanent, ongoing denial. Thus, this will be viewed as a gross and excessive act of denial of the U.S. to permit the so-called African Americans to speak their mother tongue in community with other members of their group, while the act of the U.S. may be viewed as a violation of the Convention on the Non-Applicability of Statutory Limitations to War Crimes and Crimes Against Humanity, which the U.S. has not signed or ratified. The U.S. has made itself responsible for the rights of minorities within its jurisdiction to not be denied the use of their own language in community with other members of the group. We cannot speak ours. The U.S. grossly denies us the right, having deprived us continually of the very instrument in its place. The U.S. continually has forced its Anglo-Saxon mother tongue upon us for the past 400 years. Absent our mother tongue, We are a non-people living without a permanent identity. We have brought our prayers to the Working Group on Minorities, as it has been entrusted with the task of promoting the rights of minorities. We wish to thank the Working Group on Minorities. We appreciate and applaud their efforts and join with them in the recommendation that a regional seminar for African Americans be held in order to examine the issues of African Americans in the Americas. In conclusion, we so-called African Americans support the notion that race is a constituent element of the definition of a minority. In the U.S., blacks are mindful daily of a consciousness of otherness with respect to racial differences, as every scholar knows. And unlike the indigenous peoples who were native to the territory before colonization and who formed many groups and spoke several languages, African Americans were displaced from their common territory. And yet they invoke their similar characteristics in order to obtain their rights, as the so-called African American racial group is a group destroyed. It is axiomatic knowledge that we are a different racial group from the majority. We have neither racial dignity nor political bond. The integration movement of the 1960s, whatever of high hope and of good intention, it did not make us equal with the majority, nor did it set us apart as a people or as a minority. We continue to mimic the human rights of the majority. At the same hour, during the 1960s, there had long been developing in the U.S. not only a consciousness of otherness, but also an awareness to bring that consciousness into reality. The ethno-racial differences had then reached the glass ceiling, marked by violent rioting in major cities: Watts, California; Newark, New Jersey; Rochester, New York; Cleveland, Ohio; Cincinnati, Ohio; Chicago, Illinois; Harlem, New York; Detroit, Michigan; Washington, D.C., and Atlanta, Georgia, in the time period from 1965 through 1967. U.S. federal agents cleared the way for a nonviolent solution. The U.S. government and its media sought to redirect the rising black consciousness by promoting integration. Nonviolent integration's chief advocate was the late and memorable Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who fell to his unfortunate death from an assassin's bullet in the year 1968. Having commenced the civil rights movement December 1st, 1955. Oral statement to the 52nd session in the Subcommission on the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights, August 2000, Agenda Item 8, Minorities. We appreciate and applaud the efforts of the Working Group on Minorities, and we join with them in recommendation that a regional seminar for the Americas be held in order to examine the issues of African Americans in the Americas. 31 African American organizations, from the grassroots to the intellectuals elite, stand with us today in support of the proposed regional seminar for the Americas. I came to the subcommission to seek recognition that we, the so-called African Americans, do not fit the UN established definition of human beings in the category of minority or as a people. The United States has the UN under the belief that we do fit one or the other, and that the U.S. asserts that the UN is in charge of promoting and protecting the inherent rights of human beings, everyone, everywhere. To the extent that we do not fit the UN definition presently, the UN definition is in need of expansion to also include us, for we have not our original mother tongue, culture, nor religion, thus no identity. Due to the lingering effects of plantation slavery, we are but clones of the Anglo-Saxon in the United States. During slavery, we were forced to speak the Anglo-Saxons' mother tongue and practice their religion and culture. Our human rights were destroyed. Therefore, like the indigenous people, it is our preference to be reinstated as a people, and that we have been historically categorized by continental ancestry, from which territory we were shackled and removed. We invoke that characteristic in order to obtain our rights. Notwithstanding, we have brought our prayer to the Working Group on Minorities as it has been entrusted with the task of promoting and protecting rights of minorities, in which category we are placed in the U.S. We support the notion that race is a constituent element of the definition of a minority. My people are the living evidence of a group with the consciousness of otherness, of difference, having been victims of 400 years of plantation slavery by the rigor of racial grouping.
The Afro-Descendant Economic Stimulus Plan. Drafted in concert by Afro-Descendants in the United States of America. April 5, 2009, Washington, D.C. Marked the initial discussion by African Americans for the establishment of the Afro-Descendant Economic Stimulus Plan. The gathering consisted of a cross-section of Afro-descendants representing various regions of the country, as well as various religious and political affiliations. The one thing that we all shared was a common history and a recognizable need to support a stimulus plan exclusively for Afro-descendants. Given the unique contributions to America and the desperate need facing each person, family, community, city, and state where Afro-descendants lived during these critical economic times, the outcome of such spirited discussion gave birth to the need for formal development of the stimulus plan and mobilization of interest. Thus, the heart and spirit of this plan can be felt in the following words. Whereas the current economic conditions of the American economy have left Afro-descendants vulnerable to harsher times and least likely for recovery, it is prudent of the federal government to support the Afro-Descendant Economic Stimulus Plan to assist this distinct group of African Americans. Whereas Afro-descendants have been cornerstones of the American economy demonstrated by the Atlantic slave trade and its economic contributions to the beginning of the new American government, sequential administrations, and industry. Whereas opportunities for Afro-descendants have been limited and in many cases non-existent because of socio-political and socio-economic barriers. See following note from H.R. 194. 110th Congress, 1st Session 94, February 27, 2007. In the House of Representatives, apologizing for the enslavement and racial segregation of African Americans. Whereas millions of Africans and their descendants were enslaved in the United States and the 13 American colonies from 1619 through 1865. Whereas after emancipation from 246 years of slavery, African Americans soon saw the fleeting political, social, and economic gains they made during Reconstruction eviscerated by virulent racism, lynchings, disenfranchisement, black codes, and racial segregation laws that imposed a rigid system of officially sanctioned racial segregation in virtually all areas of life. Whereas there have not been afforded any efforts to redress historical wrongs and to normalize Afro-descendant economic conditions. Whereas during good economic times Afro-descendants fared the worst, and during economic crisis Afro-descendants suffer the most. See comments by President Barack Obama. Tough times for America often mean tougher times for African Americans. This recession has been no exception. The unemployment rate among Black Americans is a full 5 points higher than the rate among Americans as a whole. At the same time, we know that government cannot and will not succeed alone. It will take all of us stepping up and doing our part. www.alphareparations.org. Whereas neighborhoods, cities and states with substantial Afro-descendant populations are economically affected disproportionately than other cities and states with different ethnic demographics. Whereas immigration policies, trade agreements, and labor relations do not consider the past and present contributions of Afro-descendants in the American economy. Whereas Afro-descendant students require the most financial need for higher education and professional certification while having the least opportunity. Whereas Afro-descendants are a part of a larger global community of Afro-descendants who exist as minorities in nation-states where they live, seek global solutions to the socio-economic and socio-political conditions that affect progress internationally. Thus, we, Afro-descendants, descendants from Africa, products of the transatlantic slave trade, participants in every major American war and conflict, cornerstones of American industry, and major contributors of American culture and life seek the support of an economic stimulus plan, supported by the White House, Congress, Department of Treasury, Federal Reserve, American industry, state and local municipalities. We seek the following in the form of the Afro-descendant Economic Stimulus Plan. Exemption of federal taxation for an undetermined number of years. Equal employment and business opportunity. Student loan forgiveness. Accompanied with tuition assistance for college and professional certification, secondary and post-secondary education. Direct economic stimulus of $8.60 trillion. $200,000 per Afro-descendant. Establishment of a global stimulus plan for Afro-descendants in the slavery diaspora. To meet these ends, we seek the audience of Afro-descendants and all mentioned parties to manifest these needs and aspirations. All for reparations and emancipation. International NGO in consultative status with the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations. AFRE delegation in Peru at United Nations meeting. Contact Ishmael Abdul Salam 22 at Bell South. Nettel 678-591-3307. All for reparations and emancipation. www. alphareparations.org.